The air conditioning in Terminal 3 is a fickle god, blasting icy currents through the check in hall only to abandon the boarding gates to a stagnant, humid heat. Mark sat at gate 118, his back sticking to the molded plastic chair, watching the man 3 rows ahead. The man was a mirror of Mark's own arrival 3 months ago. He wore a crisp, cream colored linen shirt that hadn't yet succumbed to the archipelago's relentless dampness. He was clutching a gold and brown Kultura shopping box like it contained the Holy Grail. Inside, Mark knew, would be a Barong Tagalog or perhaps a set of South Sea pearls, the "I'll be back soon" tax. The man's phone buzzed. He snatched it up, his face illuminating with a grin so wide it looked painful. He began typing furiously, thumbs dancing with the desperate energy of a man who believed every "I miss you already, Mahal" was a literal truth rather than a standard operating procedure. Mark looked down at his own hands. They were tanned, spotted with age, and trembling slightly from too much Barako coffee and not enough sleep. In his carry-on was the anchor of his own delusion, a mother-of-pearl photo frame he'd bought in a boutique in Makati during his first week. In the photo, Mark stood on a white sand beach in Panglao, his arm around Elena. He looked like a conqueror. She looked like a girl who knew exactly how much the conqueror's pension was worth. He remembered the feeling of the first week, the way the air smelled of wood smoke and jasmine, and the way the age gap seemed to vanish under the soft glow of a San Miguel sunset. He had convinced himself he was the exception. He wasn't like the other guys, the loud, red-faced tourists shouting at waitresses. He was a gentleman. He was a savior. He had seen the leaky roof of her mother's house in the province and hadn't seen a red flag. He'd seen an opportunity to be a hero. "It's different with us," he had told his brother over a grainy WhatsApp call a month ago. "She doesn't care about the money. She cried when I tried to give her extra for the hospital bills. She's traditional, Dave. You wouldn't understand." Now, the silence of the gate was punctuated by the rhythmic thump-thump of a nearby construction crew and the man's phone pings. Every time the man's phone chirped, Mark felt a phantom itch in his own pocket. His own phone sat dead in his bag. It had been dead since the final dinner at the mall, the one where Elena's cousin had shown up uninvited, needing a small loan for a business venture that sounded suspiciously like a pyramid scheme. When Mark had hesitated, the atmosphere had shifted. The traditional warmth had turned into a cold, transactional calculation that he'd been too embarrassed to name. He had spent the last 48 hours wondering if he was leaving a relationship or just a subscription service he could no longer afford. The man in the linen shirt stood up, pacing the carpet. He was on a video call now. "Yes, baby, I know. I'll send the Western Union as soon as I land in Sydney. Don't worry about the tuition. I've got you. I've always got you." The man's voice was thick with a self-important gallantry. He looked around the lounge, catching Mark's eye. He gave a small conspiratorial nod, one winner to another. Mark didn't nod back. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of nausea. He thought about the photo frame in his bag. The mother of pearl was beautiful, but it was just calcium carbonate, layers of waste smoothed over by time and pressure into something that looked like a treasure. It was a perfect metaphor for the last 90 days. He had polished the reality of his situation until it shone, ignoring the grit underneath. The tension in the room wasn't loud. It was the sound of a ledger being balanced. Mark looked at his boarding pass. One way to London. He had sold his car to fund this investment in a new life. He was 64 years old and he was going home to a rented flat and a cold winter, carrying a box of pearls that Elena had forgotten in the hotel room during their final silent morning. The intercom crackled to life. Priority boarding for flight PR 212 to Sydney. The man in the linen shirt adjusted his Kaltura box, his face a mask of tragic romantic longing. He looked like he was starring in his own movie. He started toward the jet bridge, his phone already out for one last selfie to prove he was still there in spirit. Mark watched him go. He reached into his bag and felt the sharp corner of the mother of pearl frame. His thumb traced the edge of the glass. He wanted to throw it into the trash can by the hydration station, but he couldn't. Not yet. The illusion was dying, but it was a slow, agonizing death, and he wasn't quite ready to be alone in the dark. He waited for his own zone to be called, his eyes fixed on the empty seat where the man had been, the ghost of a smile still hanging in the humid air. The Sydney man was gone, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive cologne and the echo of a hollow promise. Mark stayed in the molded plastic chair, his flight still an hour away. The silence of the gate was worse than the noise. It gave his brain room to replay the tapes. The exceptionalism phase had lasted exactly 3 weeks. That was the window where Mark believed he had beaten the system. He remembered a night in Boracay, the white sand like powdered sugar under their feet. Elena had leaned into him, whispering that he was the first man who ever truly saw her, not as a pretty face, but as a person. "I don't want your money, Marky," she'd said, her voice a soft melody over the crashing waves. "I just want a future." The first crack appeared 2 nights later. It wasn't a demand, it was a suggestion. Her brother's tricycle had broken down, and without it, the family had no income. It was 15,000 pesos, a pittance in London, a fortune in the province. Mark had paid it gladly. The hero high was better than any drug. But then the tricycle needed a new engine. Then the sister needed tuition. Then the roof, which had been leaky in his initial memories, suddenly required a full structural renovation. Mark began to notice the inconsistencies. Elena, who claimed to be simple and traditional, developed a sophisticated understanding of the exchange rate. She knew exactly when the pound sterling dipped against the peso. She started spending more time in the bathroom, her face illuminated by the blue light of a smartphone he'd bought her. One evening in Makati, he'd caught a glimpse of her screen. A notification from Steve, UK. Then another from Hans, Germany. "Just friends from the hotel where I worked," she'd said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "They are old, Marky. They are lonely. I am just being polite." The "I miss you" messages started to feel like automated scripts. He'd be in the next room, and his phone would buzz with a heart emoji. It wasn't intimacy, it was maintenance. He was a server being pinged to ensure he was still online and responsive. The tension escalated during the mandatory trip to her home province. The traditional family had greeted him like a visiting dignitary, or more accurately, like a winning lottery ticket. He sat at a long table laden with lechon and seafood, feeling the weight of 20 pairs of eyes, calculating the value of his watch, his shoes, his very existence. He realized then that he wasn't dating a woman, he was subsidizing an ecosystem. The cousin, Junjun, had been the final straw. Junjun was young, fit, and possessed a familiarity with Elena that made Mark's skin crawl. They spoke in rapid-fire Tagalog, laughing at jokes Mark didn't understand. When Mark asked for a translation, Elena would just pat his hand. "Nothing, Marky, just family talk." Then came the request for the small business loan, 500,000 pesos for a piggery. "It's for our future, Marky, so I don't have to work when you are back in London. I can stay here and manage the business for us." The logic was a beautiful circular trap. If he said no, he didn't care about their future. If he said yes, he was effectively paying for a life he wouldn't even be part of. He looked at the empty seat where the Sydney man had sat. He wanted to run after him, to grab him by his linen shoulders and scream about the phone bills and the cousins. But he knew it wouldn't matter. The Sydney man was still the protagonist of his own movie. His phone, which he had finally plugged into a charging station, vibrated. A new message. It wasn't from Elena. It was a notification from his banking app. Suspicious activity detected. Overseas transaction 25,000 PHP. He hadn't made a transaction in 3 days. The illusion didn't just crack, it shattered. He realized Elena hadn't forgotten the pearls in the hotel room. She'd left them because she'd already taken something far more liquid. The I miss you already text he'd received an hour ago wasn't a sentiment, it was a distraction. The intercom crackled again. Final boarding for flight BA016 to London. Mark stood up, his legs feeling heavy. He looked at the trash can by the gate. He took the mother of pearl frame out of his bag. The photo was still there, the two of them on the beach, smiling at a future that didn't exist. He didn't throw it away. He needed to keep it, not as a memento of love, but as a receipt for a very expensive lesson he was still learning how to name. The plane was a pressurized tube of recycled air and quiet desperation. Mark found seat 42C, an aisle toward the rear where the engine whine was loudest. He shoved his carry-on into the overhead bin, feeling the mother-of-pearl frame shift against his laptop. It no longer felt like a treasure, it felt like a lead weight. He sat down and pulled out his phone one last time before flight mode. The bank notification was still there, a digital ghost. Overseas transaction, 25,000 PHP. He scrolled back to his messages. Elena's final text had arrived just minutes after the transaction. A photo of her eyes, red-rimmed and moist, with the caption, "My heart is breaking as you leave. I am already counting the seconds until you come home to me, Mehal." The math was surgical. She had been standing at the ATM, or perhaps handing her phone to Junjun to handle the withdrawal, while she composed the poetry of her grief. The "I miss you" wasn't an emotion, it was the smoke screen for the exit fee. Across the aisle, 2 rows up, the man in the linen shirt was already leaning back, a miniature bottle of gin in his hand. He was staring at his own screen, his thumb tracing the image of a girl half his age. He looked radiant, fueled by the intoxicating lie that he was special, that he was the one who had finally cracked the code of the archipelago. Mark watched him and realized the true nature of the power dynamic. He had spent 3 months thinking he held the cards because he held the currency. He thought he was the benefactor and she was the dependent. But the dependency was a staged performance. She didn't need his love, she needed his overhead. He was the one who was truly dependent, dependent on the illusion of being a hero to mask the reality of being a man who was simply aging out of his own life. The mistakes weren't just tactical errors, they were the features of the product. The traditional girl was a brand identity. The leaky roof was a call to action. The cousin was the silent partner in a family-run enterprise. He looked at the empty seat next to him. He could almost see the ghost of the piggery he'd nearly funded. It wouldn't have been their future. It would have been a retirement plan for Elena and Junjun, built on the bones of his ego. He had been a down payment on someone else's happy ending. The plane began its taxi, the vibrations rattling the plastic interior. Mark didn't feel the sting of betrayal he had expected. Instead, he felt a cold, clinical clarity. The transaction was complete. He had paid for 90 days of feeling like a conqueror, and she had delivered the service with professional-grade precision. The bank withdrawal was just the final invoice. The Sydney man raised his gin bottle in a silent toast to the window, to the islands disappearing into the Philippine Sea. He was still in the movie. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his SIM card. It was a small gold-flecked piece of plastic, the only thing that still connected him to the Mahal script. He didn't break it. He just tucked it into the seat back pocket, next to the safety manual and the duty-free magazine. As the wheels left the tarmac, the pressure in his ears spiked. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He wasn't carrying a piece of the Philippines home with him. He was just a man returning from a very expensive theater performance, finally realizing that in a world built on survival, the only thing more dangerous than a lack of money was the delusion that it could buy anything other than silence. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft leveled off over the Pacific. Mark watched the Sydney man drift into a peaceful sleep, his Kultura box tucked under his arm like a security blanket. The man still had that half smile, the look of someone who believed he had outrun his own shadow. Mark opened the seatback tray and placed the mother of pearl frame on it. In the low light, the shell didn't glow. It just looked like what it was, the calcified remains of something that had tried to protect itself from an irritant. He realized now that he wasn't the irritant. He was the pearl's source of nourishment, and once the nutrient flow stopped, the shell would simply wait for the next tide to bring a new host. He thought about the 25,000 pesos. It was roughly 400 pounds. In London, that was a month of utility bills and a few modest grocery runs. In the province, it was a celebration. It was a new roof. It was Junjun's new motorcycle. It was the price of 3 months of feeling like his life still had gravity. He didn't hate Elena. To hate her would be to admit he thought they were playing the same game. She was a professional in the industry of hope, and he had been a willing consumer of her most expensive product, the lie that he was still a man worth choosing for something other than his bank balance. He looked at the Sydney man one last time. The younger version of himself would wake up in a few hours, check his messages, and see a good morning mahal that would fuel his next 6 months of overtime. He would live in a fantasy that made the grey cubicles of his life bearable. Mark, however, was heading back to a life that was quiet, honest, and utterly empty. He reached out and finally pried the back of the mother of pearl frame. He took the photo of him and Elena on the beach and tore it into 4 neat pieces, dropping them into the plastic cup that had held his lukewarm water. He realized the most devastating mistake wasn't the money, the cousins, or the leaky roofs. It was the belief that he was the exception to a rule as old as the islands themselves. The archipelago doesn't take your heart, it just charges you a premium to remember you still have one.